Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Small Business Show. I'm your host, Swire Ho, the promo guy. Today, my guest is Kurian Tharakan. He is the Managing Director of Strategy Peak Sales and Marketing Advisors. How you doing, Kurian?
Good, thanks, Swire, for having me on the show.
Um, would you mind to give the listener a little bit about your background? And then I know that you have a book and you like to tell people that they should develop a story to tell about themselves and their company.
Sure, I'm a sales and marketing strategy consultant way up here in Canada, in Alberta, Canada, Edmonton, the capital of the province. And I have a little marketing strategy consulting firm up here. And a few years back, I realized that my clients really needed to get on this idea of creating a narrative for themselves, a strategic narrative for their companies, for their products, for the markets that they serve. And they had a tough time doing that because no one ever asked them to do that before. So what I ended up doing was creating a framework that allowed them to tell their story in a functionally relevant and an emotionally significant way. And I eventually published that in a book called The 7 Essential Stories Charismatic Leaders Tell, which is a leadership book, but it's two types of leadership. Leadership internally for you and your people, and leadership externally for market leadership as well.
Okay. Let's start with a tough question. The reason why companies, organizations fail. Would you let us know a little bit about it? Do you see like a example or trace that why people fail and some people don't?
Well, I have a definite idea on why that is. And I think if you take a look at startups, I work with a number of startups, a lot of startups here in the province. And what I find is that, what's the statistic, small business statistic? 80% of all startups fail within the first 5 years, 93% fail within the first 10, something like that. And it's not that startups fail. A startup doesn't fail first. What fails first? And this can be startups. It can be product lines within established companies like General Motors, for example. It could be anything that is not growing is eventually dying because entropy takes over. Entropy is just a normal, natural function in any kind of entity that is deflating the overall energy. So you have to continually be able to pump this up. So the very first thing that fails is not your product. It is the story behind the product. And so the story has to be functionally relevant and emotionally significant to the customers, to the clients, so that they can see value in the adoption of that product or services value propositions. If they don't see continued relevance, continued significance, they're going to stop buying. Or they may not buy at all, and eventually it deteriorates. So if you take a look at the products that the General Motors would have put out 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they have to be in a continual state of invention and innovation. At one point in time, the Hummer, you remember the Hummer, was a big deal. And suddenly it wasn't a big deal anymore for a lot of reasons. So it had a very significant value proposition at one time, emotionally significant, functionally relevant, and then the product story started to be less and less relevant. So now, the Hummer is pretty much in the museum of General Motor products.
Right. I like that because, I know you teach people to develop a story, and that's, my question to you. And then I think about my buying experience. Sometimes I really pay a little more too to buy a good story because I really resonate with a certain brand, right? I'll even go drive 30 minutes just because I like your story and I wanted to spend money at your store or, spend money with your cost if you're a nonprofit. So I know why we have a story, but I think most of the general population, we say, we just want to make some more money. We just want to survive. And, what kind of story can we have? And what would you suggest to those people?
Well, first of all, let's define what a brand is. And my simplest definition of brand is meaning embedded in story. So when you have an affinity for Apple, or you could say Samsung, it doesn't matter which one it is. You are buying into the story first, and then the product and its value propositions, its functional benefits, all these things have to back up the promise in the story. See, that's what it is. Brand is meaning embedded in story. And so it's only when after you buy the product, you get it home, and oh, this isn't what I wanted, that you're disappointed with the promise unfulfilled in the story you thought you were buying. So that's the very first thing. You have to be able to create a brand that promises either a aspiration of gain or the alleviation of pain. So that's what you're in. The second part of this, you touched on an interesting point there, and that is, I just want to make some more money. That's the typical thing that some people say. Well,
Right.
That's a very sad state of affairs, isn't it? Really sad state of affairs, because what you really should be doing is looking for ways to create value in your customers' lives. Whatever state of value that is. And there's so many different ways to do that. And if your sole objective is to create money for yourself, enrich yourself, you're not really going to be very long for this world. That's the mindset, to me, of a con artist. Taking instead of giving. So a true entrepreneur creates value. Now, I think the last thing that a Steve Jobs thought of doing was becoming a multi-billionaire. He transformed 7 different industries by creating immense value, immense innovation, immense invention in all of those 7 industries. And that's his real legacy. Not that he's worth, $7-10 billion. He's gone now, but his wife has that legacy of the billions in her bank account now. But that's a result of creating value, not a result of taking value.
Okay. So as a small business, which is, majority of the listeners, so they're smaller, right? They might have limited resources. So how do we find the story that works for us? Do we, sometimes if you don't go deep enough, I think, then you are just having the same story like everyone else, or, better or worse, your competitor, which is a lot bigger than you. So how do we find a story? Do we need to, what kind of market research do we need to do? Or do we just have to ask us deep down, this is what we like to do. That's why we're in it. And then I have to be the best, and I don't care if we lose money. We have to spend 20 hours just to make it, nice for our client. So how would you suggest they find their own story?
You have to ask, but you can't ask superficial level questions. You have to ask the deep questions. You have to go to root motive. Okay, root need, root motive. You have to go to the real reasons for why somebody does something. J.P. Morgan, the famed banker, financier back in the 1800s, early 1900s, he had a great line. A man, and this is a sexist quote a little bit, he says, a man always has 2 reasons for doing anything: a good reason and the real reason. And you have to get to the real reason for what drives a human's actions. What is the deep motive that they have? Now, one of the easiest ways that you can do this is you can do deep research in the way of an interview or on surveys, but don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. A very quick way to do this, and quick in the sense of, being able to reach thousands of people very, very fast, is to do advertising. And I have a little digital marketing company that I'm with right now, a company called Shopify. Sorry, it's not Shopify, Socialite Communication. Shopify, I don't own Shopify. Socialite Communications, we're a Shopify agency. And we recently launched a campaign for one of our clients, and we tested 204 ad variations. Different messaging, different headlines, subheads, images. And what we're doing is finding out what people are clicking on, clicking through, filling out forms on, all these kinds of things to see the results. And when we find that, we go from 204 down to maybe 6 or 7, 4 or 5 absolutely killer ads. Now, what makes an ad killer? It primarily has to do with the implied messaging that the ad has. What is that emotional context to the message? What is the functional context to that message? What is the promise that that message is impressing upon that customer's mind? And when you get down to those 4, 5, 6 ads that are absolutely works, then you know you've hit on a chord with those people. And that's a very quick way to test whether your story has that first major element, and that is the big idea. What is the big idea? From the big idea, you would then go into a series of key messages. And then from those key messages, you would go into the strategic narrative and all of the supporting narratives along the way. And that's how you build a story. That is how you build a story. This idea of elections conducted in a very short frame of time. In the US, I know it's like 2 years for, a presidential election between the primaries and such. Here in Canada, it can be as short as 60 days, 45 days, something like that sometimes. And so you have to compress the message delivery in a very, very short frame of time. Well, how do you know whether the messages that you're delivering are correct or not? Through a lot of polling. To see what your audience is going to respond to. So until you got the big idea, then the key messages, it's only then that you can build the strategic narrative. And then you have a story that in all likelihood will work for you. And if it doesn't, go back to the drawing board.
Would you say we need to change or update our story along the line? Because you use the word, you use Hummer. Let's stay with Hummer, right? When H1 is used to have, and you couldn't buy it. It's from the military. If you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, yes, you can drive it. So then when they came out the H2, everyone was crazy. It was masculine, it was trendy, and you could roll over things, right, on the freeway at the time. But then the story, like you said, died down. It's not hip anymore. We are eco-friendly. We are things like that. Now they're trying to come up with a Hummer that is electrical Hummer. So along those lines, do you think a story needs to be updated, right? Needs to change?
Yeah, the stories need to be absolutely updated and kept relevant. Updated and kept relevant, because what happens is the demographics change. The psychographics change, the actual values and beliefs change as well. So we have a major LGBTQ movement and a couple more initials after that. Well, 50 years ago, that would not have been as prominent today. It would not have been as prominent at that time. But that's clearly a psychographic trend in today's demographics. So to recognize that within your communication efforts is going to definitely impact your communications one way or the other. I saw a bakery store, for example, on the weekend on Facebook. They had put out some rainbow cookies as part of the celebration efforts to recognize the LGBTQ community. And they were onslaught on the Facebook page with all sorts of hateful messages. And in fact, one customer canceled a major order and they were devastated. So they put this up on their Facebook page. The next day, there was a lineup around the block of people coming to support them. And they were completely sold out. Now, so the times have changed. The prejudices and also the aspirations of people from 50 years ago, 80 years ago are not the same today. As what was acceptable 80 years ago is not acceptable today. And who knows what that's going to be 50, 80 years from now. So your messaging has to change along the way as well. Your stories need to be updated. Now, there are stories that are classic throughout time. For example, the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Now, Little Red Riding Hood is a classic story. The little girl goes into the woods, despite her parents' pleas to never go into the woods, meets the wolf and all sorts of bad things happen, but eventually she gets rescued. Well, that story has been around with us for thousands of years. And it's cross-cultural. There are Asian versions of Little Red Riding Hood. There's obviously European versions, but every civilization, every culture seems to have one of these stories, and it's all revolves around a little girl that defied her parents' admonitions to not go into the woods. So there's an example of the core elements of the story having a lot of resonance and a lot of longevity. But in today's times, what I say is that your stories are probably most relevant within a 6 to 8 year time span. And why I say that is that's the typical length of time that a situation comedy lasts on air. So if you think of any kind of situation comedy, the average situation comedy, it's really fresh and new and ready to go at the beginning. But then eventually starts, losing its relevance. And if you remember the Happy Days with Fonzie and such, I don't know if you remember that. That was from my time back in the 70s and 80s. We have that moment called Fonzie jumped the shark. And Jump the Shark is there stretching their storylines, trying to stay relevant, and they couldn't do it. And it was time for that show to eventually go.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You gotta, well, you're in business, right? You gotta know your market. So it's just, a story. It's just knowing the market, knowing the trend, and seeing what's available around, affecting you doing business, and then you change along with those lines. So let's assuming that we have developed a story, we think is compelling. How can we use a story to persuade others? And I know from your book, you're saying, you would rather to have a more mediocre leader and to have a great story than have a great leader with a bad story. Why is that?
Well, because the story is the actual leader. So a great leader with a poor story becomes a poor leader. Wow, I thought he had so much potential, but what a dumb idea. Right? And if he has enough of these dumb ideas, or if the first one's a really stupid idea, you lose faith in their ability to execute, their mental competence, where their heart is, all those kinds of things. But a mediocre leader with a great story has the opportunity to become a great leader. So that they still have to develop their leadership skills, but now they're in possession of a great big idea and the key messaging and the resulting strategic narratives. So when we ask ourselves who's the leader, it's actually a dual orbit. The leader, the story, and they orbit each other. And in fact, in mass movements, if you think of civil rights, for example, or the Indian independence movement, or any mass movement, you will find that there's not just one leader. There are multiple leaders. Anything that big needs multiple leaders. And while you might have some definite leadership in certain cases, they also revolve around very similar storylines. Several big ideas, several supporting stories. And that's what these leaders promote. They promote the stories and the promise contained within those stories. So who's the leader? It's a dual orbit. The story has to orbit the leader, and the leader has to orbit the story.
Yeah, I like that because, a lot of stories that I know, start with a great leader or a concept, but then the leader is long gone. But then people, sometimes after hundreds of years, still buying into the story because that's, how the leader started, and we believe in the story, and that's why we're following it.
Exactly right. The leadership principles contained within that story are very, very long-lived. They are universal, perhaps in their values, in the aspirations of the people that hear it, and that's what gives it its longevity.
Mm-hmm. Wondering if you can share, your book, which is 7 Essential Stories Charismatic Leader Tells, 7 stories. Can you walk us through the different steps and how we could, also find the story within ourselves?
Sure. Well, the stories themselves are very, very primal in nature. They are primal questions that everybody has when they view anything of significance in their lives. And that's why there are 7 stories. And these 7 stories don't exist by themselves. They're used to infuse the 7 pillars of culture in your organization. And that's the front half of the book. And the 7 pillars of culture are the operating system that give guidance and direction to your people. Culture is the operating system. But then you use the 7 stories to make that culture come alive, because the 7 stories answer 7 primal questions. And the 7 stories are as follows. Very first one is creation and origin. How did this start? Why did it begin? What was the inciting incident that made us decide we got to do this? We have to create this. So we have creation and origin. The second story is our identity, values, and beliefs. So who are we as people? What are our deepest values? What are our highest priorities in anything that we do? So, for example, with FedEx, it would be definitely timeliness, priority, timeliness. And so their slogan is absolutely positively overnight. So it can't be, it might get there. It definitely can't be there. So timeliness is a very high priority. For various organizations, trust is a major, major, major aspect of it. In the beginning days of Christianity, for example, 2,000 plus years ago, it was a very small sect of zealots at the time. It wasn't this massive, massive religious movement of 2.1 billion people. So it was a small group of zealots at the time. And you would find that the Christians in your community, even though they may be thought of as a little bit of a wingnut, they were probably one of the few people that you can trust for honesty. Okay, and that was the initial parts of it. And that was way back then. That was like 2,000 years ago, right? Well past that. So you have to go to identity, values, and beliefs. The third story is the big idea. What is that central organizing concept that everything else is bound around? Everything else is bound around. So this is the central organizing principle. So if you go to Google, when they first started, they're into multiple businesses right now. But at the beginning with the search engine, it was to organize the world's information. That was their mission. That was their big idea. Story 4 is the enemy that we face. Now, the enemy doesn't have to be an individual. It doesn't have to be an entity. It can be simply something we fight for or we fight against. So the enemy might be we fight against childhood poverty. Okay? Or we fight for adult literacy. So it's something that we can polarize in our efforts to show that we are going to change this in one way or the other. And of course, an enemy can be an enemy as well. You can fight against terrorism. You can fight against criminal forces, cartels, drug cartels. There's a lot of things you can fight for or fight against. How are we doing? Do a quick temperature check here. Is this going okay? Keep going?
Yeah.
Okay,
I especially like that, because if you touch on what people are strongly against, then people get into your story. Then
it's polarity. You're invoking polarity. You're invoking polarity at that time. Okay. Story 5 is all about the mighty winds. And the mighty winds in this case is I say that every organization, every business is like a sailing boat. And sailing boats need wind to power the sails. So in this case, the mighty winds are the big macro trends in your overall environment, in the situation. The big macro trends are things like this: societal trends, technological trends, environmental, economic, political, and legislative trends. And these trends can billow forth your sails, refuse to billow it at all, so your sailboat is just sitting there on the water, or be so forceful in the wrong direction, it capsizes the boat. And the problem is most of us, most beginning entrepreneurs, most people who start organizations, they go out and they build the boat without ever ascertaining where that wind is coming from, the availability of that wind, or the power of that wind. And if you align your boat's design to be in congruence with the wind's direction, availability, and power, you're going to have a much better way. A much higher probability of winning. So here's an example. Back in the late 1890s, early 1900s, American Express, which was a freight forwarding company, started. And in fact, they were the first people to put out a traveler's check. The American Express traveler's check. So you could go to Europe now from the US and be able to cash a traveler's check. You wouldn't have to take cash itself along. Well, eventually they got into the charge card. By the 1950s, Visa, its predecessor firm, had started in San Francisco. By the 1960s, 1970s, MasterCard had taken place. And of course, now we have all sorts of different fintech models out there. We have Square, we have Stripe, we have all these different types of things. If you had invested, that's a big macro trend. And the macro trend is called cash to plastic. Cash to plastic. Because most people don't like carrying wads of cash around. They want to have the simplicity of a thin plastic card. And now it's all on your phone or on your watch. You will be able to, simply, go about swiping now, just on an NFC basis. If you had invested in the IPOs of MasterCard and Visa, you would have done stratospherically well, and the end is not in sight because the vast majority of the world is unbanked and uncarded. So we have huge swaths of opportunity still to be had in Africa and in Asia and in all parts of the world, in South America, that people do not yet have bank accounts, let alone credit cards. So there's all sorts of opportunity for these fintech models to take place. And it's just a macro trend that has no end in sight yet. So that was story number 5. Story number 6 is all about the journey we must undertake. Now, story number 6 is simply this. The first 5 stories are the left side of the equation. So if all those 5 stories are believable, the equal sign says this is the journey we must undertake. This is what we have to do. And so what do we have to undertake? What are the steps to go forward in order to move forward? Because sitting still is not an option. The world is a changing place. And so if you don't keep moving forward, eventually the ground underneath you will give way. And so if you take a look at, and I have a story in the book about the Fortune 500 lists from like 1955 or something like that. And the vast majority of the Fortune 500 list was not present just 30 years later. Because they were relevant at the time. They were a Fortune 500 company, but they weren't relevant enough they weren't inventive and innovative enough to continue on with that relevance. And so they disappeared from the list. So you have to continually update your value propositions to be relevant, functionally relevant, and emotionally significant for the time. Okay, and then finally, story 7 is all about why we will win. So now story 7 takes the previous 6 stories and combines it into a meta-narrative with the addition of keystone elements. And what a keystone is something that will guarantee the win to your people, because you want them to follow you. This is a leadership book. You want your people to follow you. How will you give them the confidence to continue the journey with you or to start a journey with you? And you do it with the addition of the keystone elements. Now, what are some typical keystones? Here's a very common one. God is with us. Superior technology, superior people, superior strategy. And there's hundreds of keystones that you can have. And you can see it in all sorts of stories throughout history. So you combine all of these with the keystones and away you go. The story I use in the book to illustrate the keystone principle is that in 1519, Hernan Cortez fled Cuba with 630 men, one step ahead of his brother-in-law, Diego Velazquez, who was the governor of Cuba, to go and claim the glory of conquering Mexico for himself. Now, Diego, his brother-in-law, wanted to do it himself, but Hernan wanted to claim that glory unto himself. So he flees with 630 men, and he lands on the shores of Veracruz, Mexico. This is in 1519. And when he gets there, he scuttles most of his ships and sends 2 of them back, with the message that we've landed in Veracruz and such, and we're going inland. But he was left now on the shores of Veracruz with, in front of him, the vast Aztec empire of 5 million people and 200,000 square kilometers of territory. We got a problem here. Behind him are probably charges of mutiny and hanging, for him and all his people. But in front of him are 5 million Aztecs. What is he going to do? And what he did is he invoked the keystone of death ground. And what death ground simply said to his men, look, if we go back, we're dead. If we go forward, we might die. But we may also grab untold riches. Now, I don't want to get into the morality of conquering empires and things like that. I don't want to get into that. But he gave his people a clear choice. Stay and die, go back and die, or go forward and maybe we will win. And 2 years later, after the death ground speech, Cortez and his allied Indian forces, there's a lot of Indian tribes that did not like the Aztecs at that time either. 2 years later, Cortez and his allied forces conquered the Aztec Empire simply by invoking this death ground keystone. So that's the power of belief systems that you instill in your people to get them to bring out the best of themselves to move forward in the direction that everybody can participate in.
So, Kurian, that's a very interesting 7 steps. So my question will be, would you suggest that we need all 7 steps in order to be successful? Because I felt like if we can master any one of these 7 steps, we could be somebody already. For example, if you are having the wind behind you, which is the macro trend to be behind what you are doing, then you'll be a lot easier than if you're trying to start something where, for example, you try to start a factory when electricity wasn't available. Would you agree to that?
I would agree to that. And here's the thing, though. Okay, it's not whether these 7 stories. There's 7 stories. Actually, it's not 7 steps. It's 7 stories, and the stories are not sequential. They are a cluster. They're a cluster of stories. And the absolute worst thing you can do is come up to somebody and tell all 7 stories in one setting. You will bore them senseless. But all 7 stories are primal in their answering of the questions, the primal questions in your prospect's head, in your audience's head. But one or more of these stories are going to be hyper relevant for this moment. So you want to tell the story that is most relevant for this moment for that particular audience. So you may only choose 1 story or 2 stories, but eventually if a prospect or a customer or your people are going to really buy into you and your brand, all 7 questions have to be answered through these 7 stories.
Yeah, I like that. And if you're a smart marketer, so you can see and develop the right messages. For example, one of them is against the enemy. So now we have to fight global warming. That's why you have to, use this product or use our services. Or when you say, we're ready to take charge to fight homeless situation in our industry. So we need your help. So that's the journey part. So along the way, knowing where you are within your stories, then you could pick the messages that's most relevant, I guess, for the situation that you're in at the meantime.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. When you are first introducing, for example, a new product, people probably aren't as concerned about how you decided to invent this product. What they're most interested in is the big idea behind the product and how it will transform their current situation out of pain to gain. Now, eventually, you might tell them about the why you started the company, why you invented the products and such, but it's not necessarily relevant at this moment when you first introduce that big idea.
I like that. So, having the stories in line, kind of like your mission statement, so you can reference back to it. You can see it's kind of like a plan, right? That we have. So we know what the story is like. So when we come upon that, or when maybe you become a little bit more successful, now you're getting interviews. Now people ask you, why did you come up with that innovation? Then you can tell the story of the why. But then, like you said in the beginning, that's the new idea. That we can solve everything that you have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Without question, without question. I saw a great documentary on Abraham Lincoln just a couple of months ago. And we know Lincoln as the great emancipator. We know him as that. That's his legacy, as the great emancipator. But he was a very complex man. And it wasn't as simple as that he wanted to always free the slaves. It was not as simple as that. There was a lot of gray areas in that. But that doesn't necessarily take away from his legacy. But it is important to understand the breadth of what drove the decision making and what created the motives around why he did what he did, and the forces that opposed him, and the struggles that he faced. And when you understand this, that's what makes Abraham Lincoln come from this kind of an individual to this towering giant of a figure, is by understanding all the breadth of the stories that are involved.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I encourage everyone to really listen, and you got to spend some time. You got to ask yourself a lot of questions. You got to maybe talk to your client, talk to your advisors, a lot about to find all the 7 stories. Then I think if you're able to point out and persuade people with all the 7 stories, then you're on your way to success.
I would agree.
So, Kurian, if the listener wanted to reach out to you and find out more about what you do, what would be the best way? And can you tell us a little bit more about your books?
Sure. If people, I'm going to send you a bunch of information for your show notes, Swire. So that you'll get that. You can come and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me at my website, strategypeak.com, as in mountain peak, strategypeak.com, all one word. And what I'm going to do for you, the first 5 listeners that tell me that they heard about the book and heard me on your show, the first 5 listeners that email me, Swire, I'm going to send them a free Kindle copy of the book. So just email me.
All right. Thank you so much, Kurian, for coming on to the show today. Love the story, and I'm going to go out and find my story.
Okay, terrific. Thanks for having me on your show, Swire.